announce myself.
Yeah.
Give you the floor.
All right. Well, if we're being live streamed, I will start. So, lovely to see everybody. If you're tuning in after the event, I hope you really enjoy this. My name's Dawn Ellis, and I've been looking forward to this Friday for some time, and bringing you some of my favorite stories. It's just going to be 45 minutes, so it'll be quite a lot of little stories rather than one big one. So sit back and enjoy yourself. As you can see, I've surrounded myself with colour today, and that's partly because here where I am in London, it's pretty dark and grim, and really I wouldn't know it was the end of May. So I won't be too British and just talk about the weather, but just to let you know that that's one of the reasons I'm surrounding myself with colour right now. So are you ready for a story? I will imagine you've said yes. Are you though? Are you really ready for a story? Yes. Well then, let us go to a village in Africa. And this is a traditional story. It comes from many African countries actually, and I absolutely love it. And it is about a family living in a small remote village in that big, dusty, lush, glorious continent of Africa. And there's a boy and a girl, the son and daughter of the family. Now, the boy is growing up fast and very keen on being a famous hunter. So most days he takes his weapons, which he's learning to use, and he goes off into the jungle, into the forest to see what he can trap. His sister, however, has a terrible affliction. She's blind. And some of you may have seen some of the terrible sort of blindness and diseases that happen in these remote villages, which could be cured if only there was a doctor nearby. But anyway, his little sister was blind. So she used to spend quite a lot of her time sitting outside their hut and just listening to the world go by. And so she grew up listening to the world go by. And because she was always there, people used to stop and talk to her. And she began to know everybody in the whole village. And she would pass the time of day, and every so often somebody would come who wasn't very happy, and she would give them some advice. So soon enough, she grew to have a reputation for being a very wise young girl and a good listener, which is a great thing to have in the world. Now, as she grew up, she used to listen to her brother preparing his weapons and going off for his day's hunting. And she wanted to go too. And so she began to pester him. Please take me, take me with you, take me with you. And he would say, you're joking. What use could you possibly be hunting? He wasn't a very kind brother sometimes. Sometimes boys are a bit like that. And he said, you're no use at all with no eyes. You need to have eyes to be able to hunt, and you'd be no use. Well, this went on for some time, and after a while their mother heard them and said, now stop it. You're going to take your little sister with you, and that's final. So the following day, very grumpily, the young hunter dragged his sister by the hand off to the jungle, off to the deep forest. And he walked fast, and she couldn't see where she was going, so she would trip over tree roots, and she would almost fall and stumble some of the way. But he kept going faster and faster. You can imagine the sort of mood he was in. And then suddenly she said, wait, stop, she said, stop, there's a lion up ahead. And he said, how could you possibly know that? And she said, no, shush. And she listened, and she cocked her head on one side, and she said, there is a lion ahead, but it's all right. He's just eaten, so he's no danger to us. So on they walked, and sure enough, just round the next corner, there was a lion with a very full stomach having a snooze, who had clearly just eaten. And on they walked, faster, of course, than was very comfortable for her. And then suddenly, wait, stop, she said. There's an elephant up ahead, a big bull elephant. How could you possibly know that? No, shush, she said, and cocked her head on one side. Listen. Well, he could hear nothing. And she said, it's all right. He's having a wash in the river, so he's no danger to us. He won't notice us. And on they walked, and sure enough, around the next corner, there was a river, and in the middle of the river was a bull elephant having a lovely wash all over himself. He could neither see or hear them because he was so busy sluicing water over himself. And so on they walked. And pretty soon they came to a clearing, and the young hunter said, we're going to set our traps here. He said, I will set my trap, and then I'll tell you what to do, and you'll have to do the best you can. So he gave her a piece of string, and he took a piece of string and some corn, and they were to set traps for some birds to take home for dinner. Excuse me. So he began very fast to tie a knot, make a loop in his piece of string. I'm making a loop in the piece of string. I'm making it big enough for a bird's head to go through. And then I'm scattering the corn all over the ground. Thinking to himself, what do you think he was thinking? Thinking to himself, this'll be too fast for her to keep up with. But her fingers were moving deftly over the string. She was tying a knot. She was making a loop. She'd scattered the corn very soon after he'd finished his. He said. Well, we go home now and we wait, and tomorrow morning we'll come back and we'll check our traps. So home they went. Early the next morning, they went fast into the forest again, and he held out his hand for her to grab. But she said, no, it's all right, I know the way now. And she followed him into that forest, and she didn't trip up. He said, you think you're very clever, don't you? And she didn't say anything. But all the way there, he was brewing up and moodily thinking, who does she think she is? The lion and the elephant. Somebody must have told her. She's not that clever. She's just my little sister. And then they came to the clearing where the traps were set. And great good luck, both traps had birds in them, so they knew that they would eat tonight. That's good, isn't it? But when he looked, he saw that his trap had a scrawny little, thin, tiny little bird in it that was hardly worth a mouthful, whereas her trap had a lovely, big, fat, juicy pigeon in it. Well, what do you think? He looked at those two traps. She'll never know the difference. She can't see. And then he took the birds out of the traps and he handed her the little tiny scrawny one, and he took the big fat plump pigeon for himself. He said, not bad for a first try, but look, you only got a tiny little bird. And off they went back home. But you can imagine what was brewing up inside that boy. Whether he was a teenager or not, I can't tell you. But to say the truth, he was annoyed and angry and cross with himself and cross with the world. Why, he said, if you're so clever, answer me this. Why is there so much anger and hatred and warfare in the world? Answer me that if you're so clever. Well, she said, I think it's because there are people who cheat other people and take what isn't theirs. I think that's the cause of a lot of the anger and hatred in the world. At this, his heart grew hot and it overflowed. And if he hadn't been a big, strong boy, a tear might have trickled out of his eye. But as it was, he didn't. And he said, yes, he said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I took your bird and I gave you the scrawny one, which was all I caught. He said, I'm sorry. Here, you take your bird. And he gave her the beautiful big plump pigeon. And they walked along and he felt a bit better about himself. And as he walked along, he remembered all the kind people in the village and how his grandmother used to tell him stories and sit him on her knee and when he was little. And he said, since you are so very clever, he hadn't quite got over that bit. Since you are so very, very clever, perhaps you can tell me why some people are so kind and loving and giving in the world. And she said, well, she said, I think it's because I think it's because some people learn from their mistakes and admit them and say they're sorry. And that's why the world is full of kind and loving and giving people. Oh, he said, come on, he said, you're my sister. And he took her hand and they went home. And when they got home, they were good friends. Most of the time, they were good friends from then on while they were growing up. And whenever anybody came and said, your sister's very clever, isn't she? How come she's so clever when she's blind? He would always put his arm around her and he would say, well, she is so clever because she sees with her ears. And he said, she hears with her heart. And that's why she's my sister. And that's why she's so very clever. And that is the end of that little story. I absolutely love that story. And I hope you did too. Now, would you like to hear a story about an extremely naughty monkey? This is a story that comes from Haiti. And some of you may already have heard it, but it is one of my absolute favorites. So I want to tell it to you now. So once upon a time in Haiti, which is a hot country full of tropical fruit and monkeys and wild dogs and all sorts of crazy stuff, there lived a very young, very naughty monkey. Now, this monkey would get into trouble every single day, in fact, several times a day, if it wasn't snatching your purse out of your hand and spilling all the money out. It was jumping in through your kitchen window and tipping up the pie you just made and smashing it all on the ground by mistake. If it wasn't that, it was grabbing all the fruit off the trees and then scampering up to the top of the tree and eating all the fruit and spitting down the pips so that they fell on your head. That was the sort of monkey she was. She was a very bad, naughty monkey. And we will see what happened to her. The only thing that ever got in the way of having a fun and thoroughly mischievous day was when people set their dogs on her. And sometimes people had big, snarling, wild dogs guarding their houses. Now, when a dog came after her, she would scamper away straight up to the top of a tree and sit there shivering with fright until the dog had gone away. Because a dog means a lot of trouble for a monkey, unless they can nip up a tree. Now, one day, she was sitting up a tree, chewing on a mango, and just about to drop the pip down on the ground, when an old woman came in sight. Now, this old woman lived in the village and she kept bees. And she was very good at keeping bees, and consequently, she always had a lot of honey around the place. She had too much for herself and she had too much for all her neighbors, so the rest of the honey she sold at market. And this was what she had with her as she approached the tree where the monkey was sitting. And she had a big pot on her head, and it was a big pot made out of terracotta, which is a kind of pottery. And it was full to the brim with golden, sticky, fragrant, delicious, sweet honey. And she was humming to herself as she went along because it had been a particularly good year for the bees. Now, just as she walked towards the tree, the monkey threw the pip down of the mango and it hit the old woman on the nose, and she looked up. And as she looked up, she tripped over a root and down she went. And down she went, and down the pot went, and the pot broke because it was only made of pottery. And all that honey spread in a golden puddle and golden streams all over the ground. And the old woman, she clutched her head and she said, oh, my suffering. Why, Papa God? Why do you give me so much suffering in my life? Nothing but suffering, suffering, suffering. And she went back home weeping and wailing. And the monkey twitched her nose. Something smells good. What was it the old woman had said? She'd called it something, hadn't she? What did she call this extraordinary thing that smelt so nice? And so the monkey came down the tree very quietly and carefully, and she dipped one of her fingers into the pool of golden honey, and she put it into her mouth. Oh my goodness. Have you ever tasted delicious, raw, succulent honey? It's very hard just to have one fingerful, isn't it? So pretty much immediately the monkey was taking her paw and she was scooping up pawful after sticky golden pawful of, what was it the old woman had called it? Suffering. Yes, she said, so much suffering. Papa God, you've given me so much suffering. And the monkey said the word to herself, suffering. Delicious, sticky, golden, sweet suffering. I love suffering. It's my favorite thing. I want more suffering. Who did it? Who gave it to her? Papa God. I'm going to go and see Papa God, and I'm going to ask Papa God to give me a lot of suffering. Now, I don't know if you know how to get to Papa God, but Papa God generally lives up in heaven. Every so often he comes a little bit closer. And so the young monkey, she scampered up a tree, and then she scampered across to a taller tree, and pretty soon she'd made her way up to the sky, and there was Papa God sitting, waiting for her. And he said, you've come a long way, my dear. What is it you want? You look as if you want something. And she said, oh, I do, thank you. Would you give me something? It's all I really want. And he said, certainly, I'm in a good mood today. I'll give you anything you want. And she said, suffering, please give me a life full. I want as much suffering as you can give me. It's wonderful. And he said, wait, back up. Are you sure? Did I hear you correctly? You actually want me to give you suffering? Am I hearing correctly? And the monkey said, yes, suffering. Please give me plenty of suffering. Well, said Papa God, that's pretty clear. If you're sure, I'm really sure, said the monkey, hopping up and down from leg to leg with excitement and anticipation. Well, so Papa God gave her a bag, a leather bag. It was quite heavy. And he said, you asked for it. He said, inside this bag is plenty of monkey suffering. Now, what you need to do, he said, you need to take it down away from the trees and go into the middle of the desert. And then when there's nothing else around, you're going to open up the bag. And then you can have as much suffering as will please even you. So the monkey excitedly ran down the tree, and she made her way out to the middle of the desert, and which was a long way, and she was pretty thirsty, but she was remembering all that lovely suffering and thinking how delicious it would be when she opened the bag. And so she sat down on the ground, and there was nothing in sight. There was no tree, there was no shade. There was just her and the bag in the middle of a hot, dusty, thirsty desert. And so she sat down and she opened the bag. Woof! Out came an enormous, snarling dog. And more dogs came out of that bag. 7 huge wild dogs with great big yellow teeth and drool hanging down from their tongues came out of that bag. And they took one look at the monkey and they began to run after her. And she went, ah! And she ran and she ran and she ran. But were there any trees for her to run up? No, because she was in the middle of the desert. Oh, and she could barely think. She ran and she ran and she ran and she ran until she was almost so tired that she couldn't run any farther, and the dogs were at her heels. And there, suddenly in front of her, was a tree where there hadn't been a tree before. Up she scampered, up into the branches of the tree, so high that the dogs couldn't get up the tree. Dogs can't climb trees. This is the thing about dogs. They really can't climb trees. so that she was safe, and she sat on the branch, shivering and trembling. And the dogs eventually, having barked and surrounded the tree for a long time, they went away. And the monkey sat there on the branch going, but I liked the first kind of suffering best. I didn't like this kind of suffering. Why did Papa God give me this kind of suffering? And for all I know, she's probably still sitting on that branch, trying to figure out why Papa God gave her that when all she'd asked for was some lovely, yellow, sticky, delicious suffering. But why do you think Papa God put that tree just when she was at her limit and so tired she couldn't run anymore? Well, it was him who put the tree there, and he did it because you can have too much suffering in one life. Even if you've asked for it, like that foolish monkey, Papa God will never give you more suffering than you can cope with in your life. And I don't think the monkey ever realized that, but we know it, don't we? And that's the end of that lovely story from Haiti. I hope you enjoyed that one. You did enjoy it, did you? I bet you know that one, don't you? A different version, maybe. Well, since we're talking about deserts, I want to introduce you to one of my favorite animals, the camel. Now, as we know, camels are very good at living in deserts because they've got a big hump on their back and they can go for a long time without drinking water. Now, we know what a camel looks like, don't we? In fact, some people, when they're wanting to make a joke, they say the camel is an animal that was made by committee. They go, no one person would have invented such a peculiar looking animal. And the camel isn't known for its beauty, unless you're another camel, maybe. But it wasn't always like this. I don't know if you knew that. It wasn't always like this. Long, long ago, at the beginning of time, the camel, along with all the other animals in the world, lived in a beautiful, lush, green forest, full of pools and shade and lovely places to hide behind and lovely places to go and delicious food. And the camel and all the other animals lived there. And the camel at that time had, you know the camel's tail now, it's like a little thin thing. It sort of hangs like a kind of worn out brush from the back of the camel. But in those days, the camel had a long, beautiful, luxuriant tail with plenty of hair that dropped all the way down to the ground almost. And the camel, she would swish it about the place and keep the flies off her with her wonderful long tail. And that's not all. The camel also had some splendid antlers on her head. 12-tined antlers springing out of her beautiful head. So you can imagine the magnificent animal she was in those days. And in those days, she was a magnificent animal and knew it. Oh my goodness, that camel was proud. She would walk, swaying her hips from forest pool to forest pool, gazing into the pool and saying, "Oh, you're so lovely, my dear. You're so beautiful. You're the most beautiful animal in the whole forest." And she got a reputation for being a little bit above herself. She wasn't that popular with the other animals, as you can imagine, and especially so because she used to call the other animals names. There was a horse that used to go around. Now, in those days, the horse didn't have a lovely long tail like it does now. It had a sort of thin, straggly thing that hung down from its haunches. And so the grumpy, proud camel would call it Stringy. "Hello, Stringy," she would say. "How are you? I bet you wish you were beautiful like me." And the horse was pretty annoyed at this treatment. There was also a great big stag in the forest. Now, the stag in those days didn't have wonderful antlers like it does now. It had a bald head, and so the camel used to call it Baldy. Hello, Baldy. Oh, she would say, it's Stringy and Baldy have come. Hide, everyone. You won't want to see this. Well, pretty soon the camel found herself mostly on her own because nobody likes somebody who behaves like that. And so the horse and the stag got together and plotted their revenge. Ah, yes, said the horse, I know what we'll do. And so one day they both trotted up to the camel. Hello, camel, they said, you beautiful person. Oh, my goodness, we've been invited to the lion's party. But we can't go, not in the state we're in. Nobody would have us at a party. We haven't got a lovely tail. We haven't got antlers. We're just not dressed properly, basically. So we can't possibly accept the invitation. If only there was a wise and generous animal in the forest who would lend us, just for one night, who would lend us something to wear. Oh, said the stag, you've got some wonderful clothes. Look at your antlers. They are the most magnificent. If only I could borrow them just for one night, I would make it worth my while, and I would tell everyone how very generous and what a super kind person you are. Well, everybody likes to be flattered, and the camel was no exception. Oh, she thought to herself, not only am I absolutely gorgeous, but I'm kind and noble and generous to my fellow creatures as well. I will lend my antlers to you, she said to the stag, but only for one night. And the horse said, ah, yes, and your tail. Oh, my goodness. If I could just borrow your tail for one night only. Think of the reputation you would have with the other animals. You'd be the queen. I mean, you're the queen now, but you'd be even more the queen if you did that. All right, said the camel, just for one night only, and you must bring them back. Yes, promised the horse and the stag, we will definitely bring them back. And off they scarpered, very quickly, as you can imagine, into the forest, leaving the camel with the horse's spargy little tail and nothing from the stag because he was bald, so he didn't have anything to give her. And she waited. And she waited. Did they come back? What do you think? No, they did not come back. And a day went by, and another day went by, and the camel was saying to herself, humph, humph, humph. The more she said humph, the more a hump grew on her back. Humph, she would say, staring moodily into the pools. But she didn't like what she saw. She didn't want to look into the pools in the forest any longer. So she began to walk out of the forest towards the desert. And in the desert, there are no pools. Well, there are a few, aren't there, in these oases, which are scattered around the place. But basically, there aren't very many pools. And so that suited the camel because she didn't want to look at her ugly reflection any longer. And the more she walked, the grumpier she got. And the more she said, humph, humph. And she would sometimes even spit. She was so annoyed. And then she would scan the horizon with her nose up in the air, looking, always looking for the horse to come back with her tail and the stag to come back with her magnificent antlers. But they never came back. And we know what the horse and the stag look like now, don't we? Well, that is why the camel has no antlers and why her tail is, shall we say, less than luxuriant, and why she has this big humph on her back, and why she spits, and why she's so keen on the desert. So that is how the camel became the camel we know now. Now, I think we've got some more time, haven't we? It's got time for at least one more, if you've got the appetite for it. So, Let me tell you a story about a poor boy who was a street boy, really. And this is a story from Morocco. I've spent a lot of lovely time in Morocco, and there are some amazing stories. And this is about a young boy who was living on the streets. He was homeless. He was a beggar. They used to call them beggars in those days. So he used to sit on the side of the road and hold his hand out and hope that people would take pity on him and give him enough money for a sandwich or a kebab or some delicious Moroccan tagine, if he was very, very lucky. And that was how he lived his days. He didn't have a mother or a father, and he was very, very poor. And he was sitting there on the street one day when he felt somebody touching his hand, and he looked up, and there were some kind, twinkling eyes looking down on him. And it was a young man. And the young man said, "Are you hungry?" "I am," said the boy. "I'm very hungry." "Well," said the young man, "why don't you come to my house and I'll give you a lovely feast?" And so he led him through the alleyways of what they call the Medina, which is the old part of Marrakesh and all old cities like that. Lots of little alleyways that once you've got in there, it would be very, very hard to find your way out again. And there, in the rose-coloured wall, there was a great big door. And the young man said, "This is where I live. You're welcome. Come in. You're my guest." And so in they went, and they went up the stairs and into an empty room. And the young man said, "Sit down and I'll make sure that we have food brought to us." And so you can imagine, can't you? The boy he was so hungry, he could feel the saliva in his mouth coming just at the mention of the food. And the young man was saying, we'll have meat, won't we? We'll have lovely tagine. Do you like tagine?" "Oh, yes. Oh, yes," said the boy. "Made from goat?" "Yes." "Oh, how lovely," said the boy. "And we'll have cheeses. We'll have some nice bread. And of course, we'll have something to drink as well." And the boy said, oh, that would be absolutely wonderful. Thank you." And so the young man clapped his hands. He said, "My servants will bring in the food. Just sit down and get ready to eat." And so the boy sat down, and then after a while, the young man looked towards the door, and then he looked down at the space between himself and the young boy, and he said, "Great," he said, "now they're here, let's eat the food." But there was no food. Nobody had come in through the door. Nothing had happened. There was just the empty floor between them. But the young man was saying, dip your, oh, excuse me," he said, "I shouldn't talk with my mouth full, but why don't you dip your bread into this delicious sauce? Oh my goodness, cook has surpassed himself today. You're not eating. Why don't you eat? You don't want me to have the whole thing all by myself." And the boy looked at it, and he looked at the young man. This man was clearly mad. He was mad. He'd come into the house of a madman, possibly a dangerous madman. So he'd better do what the person asked. So he pretended to take a piece of bread, and he pretended to dip it into some sauce, and he pretended to eat it. He said, "That's very nice." "Please," he said, "please," said the young man, "just take everything. I want you to eat your fill." And so the boy began to pretend to eat. And the more he ate, the hungrier he got, because even pretending to eat was making him hungry. And then his bewilderment turned to anger. What a trick to play. If this man wasn't criminally mad, then he was playing a terrible trick. And so he continued to pretend to eat. And then pretty soon the young man clapped his hands again, and he said, "I'll have them take it away, and we'll get sweets of all kinds brought to us. I bet you like dessert, don't you?" And the boy nodded his head. "Yes, I like desserts, yes." And so the same thing happened all over again. Nothing came in. Nothing was placed down in front of him. But the young man said, "Oh, I need to dip your fingers into this, dip your fingers into this bowl of clear water, he said. It'll take the stickiness off your fingers when you eat these delicious sweets. He said there's candied fruit. He said there's milk puddings. There's everything you could possibly want. Cakes, just take it, eat everything. And meanwhile, the young man was putting food into his mouth, only there was no food there. So the boy, rather slowly, started to put food into his mouth as well. And he put it in, and he was getting angrier and angrier at this trick, angrier and angrier. And after a while, the young man said, "That's enough. I think we've both had our fill now, haven't we?" And he clapped his hands. And as the young man was looking towards the door, the young boy leapt to his feet and he fell on him and he started hitting him. He wasn't a very big boy, but he took the young man by surprise, and he was punching him and hitting him. And the young man said, "Whoa, what's going on? Wait a minute, what's going on?" And do you know what the young boy said? He said, "It's your fault. You shouldn't have given me all that sugar." He said, "Whenever I have a lot of sugar, I go crazy. And it's your fault. I've gone crazy with all the sugar." Well, the young man, he just started laughing and laughing. He said, "You are priceless," he said. "I've been playing this trick on people for years," he said, "and you're the first person to take me up on it. You're the first person to turn the tables. You're the first person to make a joke at my expense. Well done," he said. And he pulled the boy to his feet and he shook him warmly by the hand. And he said, "I'm a very rich man," he said, "as a matter of fact. And I really do have food here. Would you like some?" Well, obviously, yes, he would. So once again, he clapped his hands, and soon enough, a table came in, a lovely table, and they sat down and they ate steaming bowlfuls of tagine and cheese and bread and everything they could possibly want. And while they were sitting there eating, the young man said, "I've been looking for a lad like you. I've been looking for someone to be my apprentice and grow up in my business. And I've been looking for a long time for somebody with the wit to do what you've just done. Will you take the job?" And the boy, still not really believing what was happening, he said yes, and the deal was struck. And that boy grew up to be the young man's apprentice and then partner. And finally, he took over the business from him in the end and became a wealthy man in his own right. And that is the end of that wonderful story from Morocco. Did you enjoy that? I think it's wild. It's wild that he just went, "You've given me so much sugar. I've got a sugar high." And I always get violent. I always get violent when I've had a sugar high. Brilliant. So that's the end of that story. Now, I believe we have time for one more. I'm going to tell you, let me think. I think I'll tell you another story about the desert, about the Sahara, because it seems to be a bit of a theme at the moment. Because there wasn't always, do you know where the Sahara is? It's in the middle of Africa, and it's like a big band of hot, arid sand and rock that separates, really, it separates two halves of Africa, and it's nothing will grow there. You can sometimes watch television and you can see people saying there is life in the desert. There is life there, but they're little lizards and little tiny mice that live underground. And so the Sahara Desert is one of these big sort of natural phenomenon in the world, an amazing desert. Thank you for this lovely message. So now, as I said, the Sahara wasn't always there. In fact, if you want to go and look it up, you will find that they found evidence that there were big cities in that area. ancient cities before your grandmother, your great grandmother, and her great great grandmother were even born or thought of. Underneath the Sahara, there are big cities. And so we know that the Sahara wasn't always there. So what was there in its place? Well, just normal farmland, forests, mountains, and people living in villages. And in those days, a long, long time ago, in those old days, everybody lived in peace and happiness with each other. People loved each other, people were generous, everybody was happy and shared out stuff with each other. And life was fun. It was a bit like going to a party where everyone has fun and everyone has enough to eat. And in one village, in that area, in one village, there was a family, and there were two young boys who were the sons of the family. And they were growing up to an age where their mother would ask them to sometimes do some chores. And one day she said, "Look, I'm going to trust you to feed the chickens." So she said, "I want you to go into the chicken coop and I want you to feed the chickens, check and see if there are any eggs. Pick up the eggs very carefully and put them in this bag I've got here with some soft sheep's wool in it. Bring out the eggs and make sure the chickens are fed." And she said, "Make sure that the chicken coop, which is like the chicken house, make sure that the chicken coop is properly closed, because otherwise I'm worried that the fox will get into the chickens." And so the boys said, "Yes, yes, we'll do it. We'll do it. We can do that, Mum," they said. Let me take a sip of water. And so off they went with their bag of corn and their bag of wool to put the eggs in, and they went into the chicken coop. And one of them fed the chickens, and the other one picked up the eggs and put the eggs into the wool bag. And then, just as they were about to leave the chicken coop, the older boy saw a group of friends going by, and they were all going fishing. And so he said, so he rushed out. He rushed out and joined his friends, leaving the other boy. And the other boy was so annoyed at his brother going off with his friends that he started running after them too. Now, what happened to the chickens? Nobody shut the chicken coop, and it was the job of the older brother to make sure that the chicken coop had been locked and closed properly, because he promised his mother he would do that. And what do you think happened? A fox got in and it killed all the chickens. Well, there was a huge ruction, and the mother said, "Who did that? You have destroyed our livelihood. I trusted you. You promised that you would look after it. You promised that you would shut the chicken coop properly." And the older boy, he turned round and he pointed at his younger brother and he said, "He did it. He was the one who didn't shut the chicken coop. He said he'd do it and he didn't do it. It was his fault." And the little boy was going, it wasn't. But nevertheless, his mother spanked him and she punished him and she put him to bed, and he wasn't allowed out for a week, and nobody spoke to him. It was such a serious thing. Now, that older boy, he had told a lie, hadn't he? He told a lie. And that was the first lie that was ever told in the whole world. And the Creator looked down at this paradise that the Creator had created. And the Creator looked down and there was a lie spoiling it. And the lie creating punishment and unhappiness. And so the Creator said, "This has got to stop. No more lying. From now on," the Creator said, "if anybody lies, I will put 1 grain of sand down in the world." And so every time somebody told a lie, another grain of sand went down. And to begin with, the people thought, 1 grain of sand? What difference is that going to make? 1 grain of sand. And so they continued in their ways, cheating and lying and getting out of trouble by putting the blame on other people. And every time another grain of sand came down. And you know what happened, don't you? Pretty soon, all those grains of sand became a desert. And pretty soon, the desert started getting in the way of all the greenery and drying up the land. And so that is why we have the Sahara Desert, apparently, because of lots of people telling lots of lies for thousands and thousands of years. Now, does everybody lie? No. And how do we know that? Because in the desert, it's not just sand, it's not just grains of sand. There are lovely places where you can go where there's cool water and trees and shade. And these places are called oases. And when you're trekking through the desert and you're going from one place to another, you can go and you'll know that at the end of the day's travel or the night's travel, there's an oasis where you can stop and you can camp and you can have something to drink. And that is because not everybody tells lies. Some people tell the truth, and that's why there are still lovely places to go in the desert. I think that's probably my last story. So I'd like to say thank you for coming. And if you're listening or watching again later on, thank you for being here and listening and watching the stories. And I wish you well, go well, and please tell the stories to other people because that's what storytelling is. Take care. Bye bye. Bye bye, everybody.